you will get a PDF copy of the slides that I'm going to share with you. So sit back, listen, and hopefully you'll learn a couple of new things over the next hour. Cool. So what are we going to cover in the next hour? Why are we reducing carbon? Hopefully that's fairly patently obvious, but I'll go back to that a little bit. Then we'll get into some of the targets, the response and the progress that we have to date. We'll move on to what net zero is and the different views of what net zero can be. And then some important stuff about how we reduce carbon in line with net zero. And then we'll finish off with what we do with residual carbon, the offsetting piece. So why are we reducing carbon? Just very briefly, this is one picture of many, many pictures that I could show you about some of the reasons why we should be reducing carbon. We're clearly looking at a picture of the Earth here. What we're seeing in the different colors, the shades of orange and red and blues in certain cases, is the difference in the surface temperature of the Earth compared to pre-industrial levels. So the deeper the red, the more of a difference, the more of an increase there is in the temperature recorded by weather stations across the globe that's different compared to what it was over 150, 170 years ago. So it's showing that shift. And the further north you go or the further south you go away from the equator, you can see that the temperature differences or the temperature anomalies are getting up to 4, 5, 6 degrees Celsius. The Earth overall has gone up by about 1.1 degrees Celsius since the Industrial Revolution, but it's not evenly spread out as this diagram shows. So the effect of this is that we see more extreme weather events, more frequent weather events as well, and that's leading us down the road of us needing to reduce our carbon emissions as much as possible. So what's the response, the target and the progress so far to date? Well, let's go a little bit back in time, 16 years ago. Quite a seminal report came out called the Stern Review by Lord Stern, eminent economist, and his team looked at what we need to do as a nation, as the UK, to reduce our carbon emissions. And some of those stats on the left-hand side are the key headlines that come from it. What they're essentially saying all the way back then is that we need to reduce our emissions by about 60% from where they were then. That was rapidly revised to 80% emissions reductions. And from the economist's point of view, it was very clear that we should be doing this now, because in terms of the cost, it would be a lot less to do that now rather than waiting 20, 30, 40 years from today. And you can see that difference in the GDP. So that was a landmark piece of work. It very much set the route that we need to reduce our emissions down as much as we can. And this is some of the mantra behind net zero: reduce our emissions as much as possible. That led very quickly on to the UK's Climate Change Act in 2008, and that basically said we as a country need to reduce our emissions by 80% by the year 2050, compared to a 1990 baseline. And what you're looking at here is a graph from the Committee for Climate Change. This was produced a few years ago now, of course, and what you can see is that reduction in the UK's territorial emissions down to 80% lower than they were in 1990 by the year 2050. So the solid black line is what we've done already, and then the dotted line is our trajectory out from that. So that's where the Climate Change Act came in 2008. One of the first countries, if not the first developed nation, to actually enshrine this into law. Moving on from that through time, we had the Paris Climate Change Agreement, which again is important for net zero and other things like science-based targets. This said that we need to reduce our emissions to well below 2 degrees Celsius, if not even 1.5 degrees Celsius, in terms of the rise in temperature compared to those pre-industrial levels. And each nation has to contribute to that. So that third bullet point is talking about the UK's nationally determined contribution, our NDC. And each country was encouraged to pledge one of these, and our NDC is a 68% reduction compared to 1990 by 2030. What we as a country are going to do to reduce our carbon emissions, to bring them down as much as possible. So that was the Paris Climate Change Agreement 2015, ratified in 2016. A couple of years later from that, we had the special report from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And essentially, I'll just bring up all the bullet points so you can see them. Essentially, they were saying the impact on the planet, the weather systems, biodiversity, on the built environment would be much, much less if we restrict our warming to 1.5 degrees rather than 2. We had kind of been working to 2 degrees Celsius with an aspiration to 1.5, but the evidence that came out in October 2018 from the IPCC was very clear that said, just for that ½ a degree difference between 2 and 1.5, we can have far less damage to natural ecosystems, to the built environment, to livelihoods, so on and so on. And it, as you can see on the slide, it's basically saying we need to work across all sectors and we need to have rapid and deep decarbonisation ongoing. So this was really the catalyst to say, let's leave 2 degrees behind and move to 1.5 degrees Celsius as the cap on the warming that we want to achieve. Bearing in mind we're already at 1.1 degrees, we want to cap it at 1.5 to avoid the worst effects of climate change. And you see that final bullet point, an interesting one. To achieve that, we need to have power generation that is renewables in the majority. 70 to 85% needs to be renewable powered generation. So the Climate Change Act 2019, as Theresa May left office in 2019, she and her colleagues updated the Climate Change Act. So if you remember a few slides back, it was an 80% reduction by 2050. They changed it to say, no, we want 100% reduction by 2050. And this is where the net zero bit comes in. So this is the UK's territorial emissions, what we're going to do to reduce them by the year 2050 compared to that 1990 baseline. So you can see the graph on the right is similar to the one that you saw previously. You've got the timeline along the horizontal. You've got our emissions going up the vertical in millions of tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, megatons. And again, the solid black line is what we've reduced since 1990. In this graph, it's about a 41% reduction. The report that came out yesterday from the Committee for Climate Change says we've reduced by about 47% since that 1990 baseline. So that's the solid black line coming down, which is really good progress. But we've still got that purple dashed line to get down to net zero by 2050. So we haven't got that little buffer that we had on the previous slide that says 80% reduction. We're now saying, no, we need to be net zero by 2050. I'll come on to the net bit of net zero in a second. For those of you in Scotland or Wales who have business there, the targets are slightly different because of devolved administrations, and rightly so. Different kind of economies, different availability of renewable energy, that kind of thing. But essentially, they're the same targets, pretty much. Similarly, for the Republic of Ireland, they've got a piece of legislation that's the same as the UK's in terms of the targets. So we're kind of starting to all pull in the same direction. And then about a year to 18 months ago, the UK published an intermediate target, legislative target, that by the year 2035, we'll have reduced our emissions by 78% compared to that 2030 baseline. So 78% seems an arbitrary number, but it's actually just a milestone along that purple dashed line. Basically saying, look, we're not going to wait till 2050. We need to have a way marker, a milestone that we can check that we're doing the right things. So it's been enshrined into law now as an extra piece to the Climate Change Act. So we're building towards that net zero. What you've seen so far is that understanding that we need to reduce our emissions. The science says we need to cap them as low as possible in terms of that temperature rise. What do we need to do to get there? And then this concept of reducing our emissions down as much as possible, as in this picture here, is getting us towards that, reducing our emissions so we can limit the worst effects and impacts of climate change as much as possible. Bringing it closer to home, some of you will be aware of the Procurement Policy Note 0621, came out in June 2021. That's all that the 0621 means, June 2021. And it's a piece of public procurement policy from the UK government, and it essentially says that any contract that's worth £5 million or more per year from a central government department or one of its agencies or one of its non-departmental public bodies has to come under, is within scope of this policy note. And it's essentially saying that any work has to be done in compliance, in alignment with the UK's Climate Change Act. So contractors need to have a carbon reduction strategy. You need to confirm your commitment to achieving net zero by 2050 in the UK. You need to produce baseline data and data going forward on your emissions. Your direct emissions, which is scope 1, your indirect emissions, your electricity scope 2, and some of your supply chain, value chain scope 3 as well. Reading it, it's quite short, but it's got a lot of power behind it in terms of driving that carbon reduction message. If I know procurement at all, this will be driven through supply chains as well. It'll be cascaded down with back-to-back T's and C's. It's been enforced now for probably about 9 months from the 30th of September last year. We're seeing some organisations coming through saying that they are seeing this and they're having to respond to it already. So it's starting to bite. This is applicable to not just construction and built environment, it's any public sector contract. And importantly, there are some public sector organisations who are technically out of scope of this policy note, but are deciding to align to it. So one of the biggest of those is the NHS. They're going to come into alignment with this April next year, 2023. So more and more organisations are coming on board with it. And there are plans as well, bills going through Parliament on an embodied carbon law. So taking the building regulations and adding a Part Z, as it's known, to look at measuring and reducing the embodied carbon of emissions as well, not just the direct kind of tailpipe emissions from the works that we do. So that's all the context, what's been going on. You remember back in November, we had COP26. We've got COP27 coming up quite soon in Egypt in November. So hot on the heels, that's following through. Lots of good activity in Glasgow there, looking to reduce emissions as much as possible. There's a very clear message about looking at adaptation as well as mitigation. It's not just about reducing emissions, it's about adapting our infrastructure, our built environment, our facilities to a changing climate as well. More of a focus on methane, so being more holistic than just tailpipe carbon dioxide emissions. So good progress, considering everything else that's going on in the world. So what is net zero? You've heard all the context about want to reduce those emissions, bring them down as much as possible. There's trajectories to bring them down, the Climate Change Act in the UK and net zero as part of that. So what does net zero mean within that? This picture kind of sums it up for me, and it's a good way of describing the concept of net zero. So again, just to describe it for a second or two, you've got the timeline along the horizontal. So from 1990 all the way out into the future. Along the vertical axis, you've got global emissions of greenhouse gas emissions. So it's not just the UK, it's the whole world. It's not just CO2, it's all the other greenhouse gases like methane and nitrous oxide. They're measured here in gigatons, which means billions of tons, 9 zeros after the main number. So you can see on the graph, we've got this gray line that's slowly going up from 1990. That's the global emissions of GHGs, and they're topping out now at about 50 gigatons globally, annually, for all those different gases. What the climate modelers have done have modeled different scenarios. Basically, they've asked the question, if the world were to release so many tons of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, what would happen to the temperature? And that's what these 4 or 5 different lines are showing you. So if we carry on going up in that trajectory and we don't change, and we just grow and more people and growth and economic development, what would the world look like? And there you can see it's between 4 and 5 degrees warmer than it was pre-industrial revolution. That's clearly quite dramatic, quite drastic compared to the 1.1 we're at now. And then as you work your way down that graph, you can see that there's various different scenarios. And these are combinations of many different scenarios, but the kind of the main ones. With current policies, you could have a world that's still between 2.5 and 3 degrees warmer than it is now. But we're looking to put in other pledges and targets, other initiatives and programs as well. Bring that down, and you can see that coming down and down as we go. Just one point that you might be thinking about, why do those scenarios broaden out? And that's basically because as we get further into the future, there's less certainty. So there's more uncertainty as we get further ahead of ourselves, and that's why they broaden out. But if we can focus on the lowest one of those, the 1.5 degree pathway, the one that we are now focusing on, you can see that even at 2050, the year 2050, where the red line is, there's still some carbon emissions. Globally, there are still some carbon emissions, whether that's from agriculture, whether it's from aviation or certain sectors that are unable to, for whatever reason, fully decarbonize all of their emissions. That's saying that either they don't have the technology or it's the ways of working in that sector that they are unable at that point to fully decarbonize. And the interesting point for net zero is that saying we still have some emissions. And what we need to do is balance them off. We need to net them off. We're going to reduce our emissions as much as possible, which is what that trajectory is here, this 1.5 degree trajectory in that kind of green color. But even then, we need to balance off what we still can't decarbonize. We need to remove those carbon emissions somewhere else to net them off. That's basically the concept of net zero. Importantly, when people talk about science-based trajectories, this is the science. If you're getting a science-based target or you want to reduce your emissions in accordance with the science, it's looking at this macro global level and saying, this is what we need to do as a planet. So therefore, as an organization, as a business, this is what we need to do as well. We need to match and mirror that trajectory down albeit on a much smaller scale for obvious reasons. Bring those emissions down, reduce them as much as possible through various different methods and means, and then, and only then, look at netting off what is left over. So just to put a bit more description on that, and fill it out a bit more. So yeah, net zero is about reducing your emissions as much as possible, following the carbon hierarchy, which I'll come on to in a minute, and the Paris Climate Change Agreement, and the science that goes behind it, that science-based piece. Importantly, net zero is becoming accepted now that net zero applies to your whole value chain, your upstream supply chain, your downstream customers as well. It's not just your own organization. It's not just the buildings and the fleet that you have. It's everything else. It's your suppliers, the materials, the goods and services that you buy. It's your customers' use of energy because of the products that you are providing them, that you are selling to them. In many cases, particularly in our sector, the supply chain can be more than 80% of your overall greenhouse gas emission impact. In some cases, it can be 90, 99%, depending on the kind of organization you are. So to be truly net zero, you can't just focus on your own organization. You need to look at your supply chain. You need to look at your value chain. It's correct to get your own house in order first before you go out preaching, but very much look at your supply chain and your customers and your value chain as well. And then, as I've said already before, only when you've done as much as you can to reduce your existing emissions, then look to dealing with offsets or carbon removals for those other emissions that you can't yet decarbonize. So one definition that is pertinent to us is from the Green Building Council, framework definition for net zero carbon buildings. I'll bring both pieces up. They have two definitions that kind of go together, one on construction, one on operation. Clearly, there's a lot of carbon that goes into the materials and the construction of a building or an asset, a facility, whatever it happens to be. That might be about 25, 30% of the overall building's impact. The remaining amount comes from the operational energy. Obviously, it depends on whether it's a commercial building, residential, whether it's roads, rail. They will differ, of course, but they both have that element of construction, embodied carbon of the materials, and then the operational lifetime of the asset. And as you can see on the screen, it's basically saying reduce your emissions as much as possible up to the point of practical completion, get them down as low as you can, and then if there are any emissions remaining, you can look at offsets or the net export of renewable energy. So it's the same kind of mantra. Bring your emissions down as much as possible and then net off what's left over to get to that kind of 0 point. They just break it out by operational and construction because many organizations sit in one camp or the other, of course. I want to stress that there are many phrases out there. I'm sure you've heard of lots of them already. Net zero, carbon neutral, climate positive, carbon negative, carbon positive. There's various words that you can combine in different formats, basically. But the two main ones that are out there are net zero and carbon neutral. We've just covered net zero. I'm going to express what carbon neutral is about because it does have a definition. And as it says, they are similar but different. They are both about a zero-sum balance between the greenhouse gases emitted in one place and the same amount that is offset or sequestered in a different place. But they've got different boundaries. They cover different amounts of emission, basically. So whereas net zero was everything in your value chain, your suppliers, your customers, your scopes 1, 2, and 3, carbon neutrality generally focuses on your scopes 1 and 2. Scope 3 is optional. It's encouraged, but it's optional. So scope 1 and 2, for those of you who are not too sure about your scopes, scope 1 is your direct emissions, where you burn something yourself directly, whether that's gas in a boiler in your facility or diesel or petrol in one of your vehicles. That's your direct scope 1. Your indirect scope 2 is your electricity that you buy off a grid provider, of course. Scope 3 is your supply chain. So they've got very different boundaries between them. Neither one is not to say that carbon neutrality is not good enough, but it's a stepping stone on the route to net zero in some respects. There's also something there about ambition. Net zero should ideally be aligned to the Paris Climate Change Agreement, that curve that was coming down to 1.5 degrees earlier. Carbon neutrality doesn't have to follow that. It can be whatever reduction you want to do or you think you can do. It doesn't have to be aligned with the science of Paris. And then carbon neutrality is described more fully in a publicly available standard, PAS 2060. That's the standard that you can use to get carbon neutrality, and you can be accredited to that. You can get a third party to come in and look at your data and say, yep, we've got your baseline, we know what your scopes 1 and 2 are, we know what reduction actions you've taken, whatever those might be, and then you can use offsets to kind of neutralize that remaining carbon that you've got. Net zero, on the other hand, doesn't allow for offsetting in the way that you can use carbon reductions or avoidances. It's all about removing carbon, which we'll get onto in a bit. So just as a kind of reiteration, be careful if you're engaging with suppliers or customers or other stakeholders when they talk about net zero and carbon neutral. Check they know what they're talking about when they use those phrases. What do they mean by them? There are quite a few organizations out there who'll say they're net zero. When you actually look into it, you realize they're actually just focusing on their own organization. They're not looking at the wider piece. They're not looking at their value chain. They're not looking at following the trajectories of Paris, for example. So go in with your eyes open. It's a bit of a, some people use the phrase Wild West. Some people use the phrase a bit of a VHS Betamax. There's a bit of coalescence that needs to happen with some of these phrases. So basically, they're not quite the same. So do check that as much as possible. And as I say, offsetting, carbon removal does have its role to play. I know it can come with some bad greenwashing, but it does have its role to play. If you're doing carbon neutrality, you can use offsets. If you're doing net zero, you need to look at carbon removals. Okay. And then for those of you who are doing science-based targets, and I won't dwell on this too much because there's a separate session that we run on science-based targets, how science-based targets aligns with net zero. And essentially, it's kind of reinforcing that same message. Reduce your emissions as much as possible, and then think about using robust, high-quality carbon removal schemes, sequestering schemes to reach that long-term net zero goal. Because any organization, any sector will probably struggle to remove every single carbon emission that you have. So again, it's that same kind of mantra. Bring it down as much as possible and then balance off what's left over. So the UK's approach to net zero. Just as a bit of a scene setter here with the UK's grid electricity, we've been reducing the carbon emissions associated with the electric we get over the last 30 odd years. And you can see on the graph that essentially the carbon content of each unit of electricity, each kilowatt hour, has come down quite a long way since 1990. It's come down by about 67%, 2/3. So back in 1990, for every kilowatt hour of energy that came down the wires and out of a plug socket to you, had led to the release of 900 grams of carbon dioxide. We're now at somewhere around 300. It's probably even less now that the latest DEFRA emission factors have come out last week. So we're around 2/3 lower than we were some time back. And there's two big reasons for that. First of all, we had the dash for gas in the 1990s, where we moved a lot of our power fleet away from coal to gas turbines. So that did a lot for us. And then more recently, as I'm sure you're aware, there's been a lot of investment in renewables, solar PV, offshore and onshore wind turbines, biomass, other kinds of things as well. So a lot of this has been that kind of decarbonisation, that coming down towards net zero has been done for us when it comes to our own electricity use, our scope 2. And then to look at this more widely by sectors, what you're looking at here is a graph from the Committee for Climate Change. And what they're looking at is the different routes that different sectors, macro sectors in the UK need to take to reduce their emissions as far as possible. So let me just bring up some of the bullet points. You've got various different coloured lines here showing how they all come down, and you can see which ones they relate to. So I'm just going to pick out a couple for you here, if I can just use my mouse. Manufacturing and construction, where most of us are, is this kind of grey line, and it's kind of hidden here, but it's basically saying this is the trajectory that sector needs to follow to bring its emissions down by 2050. What's expressed on the graph is not tons of carbon, but starting where in 2019 when this was made, if that was saying that's the maximum amount, we're at 100. It's been normalised basically. We need to reduce our emissions down. You can see some of the others, like surface transport is a big one here. That follows a kind of a similar picture. Aviation is this one that went really down and back up. That was basically the pandemic when nobody flew for a few months. So that's clear to see there. And then there's others that I want to point out, like agriculture, for example. You see their green line doesn't reach zero. This is the one I was talking about earlier, where even by 2050, they're going to still have some emissions of greenhouse gases. Essentially, the way agriculture works, the way livestock farming works, there will be inevitably some greenhouse gas emissions. So those sectors can't reach the net zero, or it's predicted that they won't through existing technologies and ways of working. Similarly, aviation is still really high up here as well. It takes a lot of energy to defeat gravity and keep a 600-ton jumbo jet or an Airbus in the air for 4 or 5 hours. So that's a huge amount of energy, and having enough dense energy to do that is quite a challenge at the moment. It's possible on shorter flights, smaller aircraft, of course, but to do those big international flights, it's harder. So you can see there's a different trajectory depending on the different sector, and the CCC are looking at this on a regular basis and updating it. Taking a finer, closer look at manufacturing and construction, again, I'll just bring up the bullets. This is the makeup of the kinds of technologies and techniques that will be used to follow that line down to 2050. So you can probably read some of these here, but just to pick out the different combinations of different things that we can do. We can become more energy efficient. You know, that's going to save money as well. Do the same with less, or do more with the same. We can have better ways of manufacturing, change our materials, look at different ways of doing things. And then you can see as you move further down, there's different fuel sources as well. There's bringing hydrogen online as a fuel source for when we need high levels of heat that can't easily provided by electricity. So that's swapping out natural gas, fuel oil, those kinds of things, and bringing in hydrogen instead to provide the heat to manufacture fertilizers, for example, or in the cement manufacturing sector. And then as you move even further down, you can see some of the carbon removal technologies here. You've got BECCS and CCS, which I'll explain a bit more, but it's basically carbon capture and storage in its different manifestations. So at a sectoral level, this is what we need to do to bring down to as close as we can to net zero. And again, the same point here, if I get my mouse to show, there's still a gap at 2050. There are still some emissions. So that's what we need to net off as much as possible. Whether it's through CCS or other means, we need to remove those carbon emissions to get down as much as we can to net zero through the carbon budgets that we have. Okay. So how do we reduce our carbon in line with the science and with net zero? I've mentioned this briefly already, but there's two things we need to be looking at. It's not just mitigation to reduce our emissions, which is clearly important to follow those trajectories down, but we need to look at adaptation as well, making sure that the built environment, the assets, the buildings that we construct, that we design and construct, are adapted to a changing environment. So those buildings will still be viable and useful and workable in the decades to come. We won't have to go back and rework them and spend extra money, time, cost, carbon in terms of adjusting them for a changing environment. Again, what I like here is that there's lots of different opportunities for us to do that. There are many, many different solutions to it. There's no one silver bullet, which is great because then we can adjust what we need to the things that we have to do. This is barely an exhaustive list at all. So just some of the carbon reduction actions, and this is just again a small snapshot. It follows something called the carbon reduction hierarchy, which I'll show you in a minute. There's again that mantra of there's lots of different things we can do. We can avoid using energy where possible. If we can work from home, if we can do teleconferencing rather than traveling, clearly that's been a big part of the last couple of years. We can use passive design where possible in some of the things that we design and construct. Can we avoid the use of energy, basically? Can we use natural heating, natural lighting, if that's possible? In many circumstances, we can't do that, of course. We're going to have to use some energy. So can we be more efficient with that energy, whether it's the machinery, whether it's transport, regulated and unregulated energy? Can we look at the different equipment we have and how we use it? Can we look at the materials that we use? So here we're bleeding into circular economy issues. Can we use more recycled content? Can we use different materials? Can we use less material? Lightweighting, streamlining, all of these kinds of eco-design principles all come in and they all work together on that circular economy kind of mantra alongside embodied carbon and reduced carbon emissions. Can we design products that are not disposable, that they are reusable? And if they're not reusable, can they easily be recyclable? So lots of opportunities here, lots of eco-design options. And then importantly, can we bring the behaviors that come in with that? It's the people part. The machine is one bit, the product is one thing, but there's the person as well. How those interact is really important. To get our optimal savings, we really need people to understand what they're using and how they use it. avoid idling with plant and machinery, switching lights off, all that mantra that we've had for decades about last one out, lights out, it's still true today. If we can bring in and instill those behaviours, then we'll be a long way down the path. And then finally, if we've got the budget and the space and the inclination, we can look at zero carbon sources of energy, whether that's PV, renewables, CHP, all the different options are out there. So all of these are opportunities to look at. And that, as I say, fits into the carbon hierarchy. So it follows the same kind of mantra as the waste hierarchy of avoid, reduce, reuse, recycle. Again, it's avoid that energy use I just talked about. If you can't avoid it, reduce what you use by being more efficient, bringing in those behaviors as well to enhance that efficiency. Switching to low carbon forms of energy where possible. So, you know, not only using less energy, but that energy that is used is derived from a zero carbon source rather than a fossil fuel source. We have to remember that energy and carbon are related but different. And then finally, when you've gone through that kind of process, what can we strip out? What can we be more efficient with? Then think about your compensation and your carbon removal, your offsetting. And that builds into a carbon reduction strategy. So if you're thinking about net zero, if you're thinking about science-based targets, you need to think about a carbon reduction strategy that sits underneath that. How are we going to achieve that net zero plan? How are we going to achieve our science-based targets? So there's a kind of 5-step simplified process here about understanding what you're trying to achieve. What is the goal? When is the goal? What is the scope? What's included within that? Is it all of our business? Is it just one facility? Is it one project? So what's involved in that is really important. There's a measurement piece. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. It's a cliche, but it's true. If you can't do that, you can't understand how much progress you've made. But also you need to identify your hotspots. Where are the key areas where carbon is most prevalent? Because those are the ones you need to focus in on. It makes obvious sense, but go after the big stuff. Don't go after the paper cups in your office. It's very visible and it's an important thing to do, but it's not going to contribute much for your carbon. So go after those hotspots. Then go out and actually do it. Implement those plans. One thing that you will have heard if you've heard me speak on the carbon reporting module is about the Energy Savings and Opportunities Scheme, ESOS. That essentially takes you through this process. But one thing that's missing from that piece of legislation is the compulsion to actually enforce any carbon reduction savings that you identify. It seems foolhardy to go through that process and say, we're not actually going to do those reduction opportunities. Seize them. If you've identified where those hotspots are to reduce your carbon and probably save money in the long run as well. It might not be immediate, but it will be in the long run. Put those actions in place and then go back around the loop and remeasure it. How much have you saved? How much have you reduced? What else could we do? What could we do better? Then think about, well, we've got this bit that we can't get rid of yet because we can't afford a new piece of kit, or the technology is just not there yet, or it's not available on the market. Then we can think about the removals and offsets that I'll come on to in a few minutes' time. And then when you've done that, tell some people about it, either because you have to, because of science-based targets, you have to publicly report, or CDP, or any of those other mechanisms, or if you're just doing it off your own back, put it on your website. It's really good for your business. It's really good for work winning and for recruiting people and for shareholder value and so on. I want to go through a case study where they thought about carbon reduction right from the beginning, right from the design stage. It's going right back to the beginning. And again, if you come to one of my other workshops on carbon or designing out carbon, this case study's in that as well. It talks to the idea that if we get right in at the design stage, we can reduce out as much carbon and head towards a net zero carbon target. So this is a development by Land Securities in London. They want to be the first commercial building that's operated in line with the GBC's net zero carbon buildings framework that I mentioned a few slides up. They're looking at everything, scope 1, 2, and 3, the whole supply chain. And they're looking at various different techniques like design for manufacture and assembly, DFMA. How can they use modular components, consistent components to reduce the impact, to reduce the time and other productivity issues as well. So what you've got here is some of the outcome from that in terms of the predicted results. It's not just about carbon. It's important to say that carbon is just one of many factors to increase other metrics as well, whether it's productivity on site, the time on site, cost savings as well, other reduced impacts that go with it. So carbon is a lens to look at through all of this, and net zero carbon is a great driver for pushing forward on being more effective and more productive. If you've got that target that's driving you forward, it's going to make you get on and off site quicker and do things more effectively. You can see they use passive design techniques, so that's at the top of the carbon hierarchy, if you can avoid energy where possible. They use the stuff at the bottom of the hierarchy as well, air source heat pumps, solar panels, as well as efficient equipment within that. And then going into the operational phase of the life, they'll be using green tariffs, purchasing green electricity in effect. There's a couple of links there that you can see when you get the slides. You'll be able to click on those and go through to some more detail on those. One's a case study and the other one is quite obviously a video you can watch and learn more. So what do we do with hard to decarbonize residual carbon? So you've gone through that process, you've gone through the carbon hierarchy, you're following your trajectory, you've said, we want to be net zero, we're swapping out equipment, we're training our people, we've put some solar panels on the roof, we're changing our fleet away from diesel to electric where possible. That will take time, yep, but we've got a plan to do that. We've got our strategy and we're measuring and all of that. What do we do with that bit that we still can't get rid of yet? How do we get rid of that? How do we manage that process? So, some principles. What does offsetting mean? I'm sure many of you get the concept of this, but just in case, it's compensating for greenhouse gas emissions that arise from an organization or a product or a project in one place that are balanced off, that are compensated by removing greenhouse gas emissions elsewhere. And that could be through a different combination of projects and initiatives that actually remove that carbon or balance that carbon off. There's different ways of looking at it. So essentially you invest, the process is you invest cash into projects that will lead to lower carbon emissions when compared to a business as usual situation that would have otherwise not have happened naturally. So there's a few key points in here. It's not just paying for something to happen, it's to make sure that the emissions will be lower than a business as usual and that they are additional to what would have happened otherwise. So there's some key criteria in offsetting. So the benefits of some of carbon setting. It's one way of getting the polluter to pay. So you can put a price on carbon. It's a relatively low price, but it's getting the polluter to pay, and it lends some kind of responsibility to the emitter for doing what they do. It helps invest in those schemes. So the whole point is that those schemes wouldn't be running if they didn't have the investment within them from overseas, from other organizations, that they wouldn't be happening anyway. And it reduces our reliance on fossil fuels in some shape or form. There are other co-benefits as well. Like I was saying with the Landsec case study, it's not just about carbon. If you're burning poor quality fuels and you're putting in an offsetting scheme that moves to a lower carbon fuel or a cleaner fuel, not only are you reducing your carbon and avoiding certain carbon emissions, but you're probably also reducing air quality pollutants like NOx and PM. And that can lead to health benefits as well. Well-being, social value, community benefits that go with it. Likewise, if you're investing in a scheme that provides jobs to people, that's social value, it's providing local employment, it's providing local supply chain opportunities as well. So there's a ripple effect here. The catalyst might be reducing carbon, but if you can have other co-benefits like the increased biodiversity, job provision, supply chain, better healthcare outcomes, you get a double whammy or a triple whammy from your investment. And as the strategy 5 steps that I showed you earlier, it's part of a carbon reduction strategy. You can use that at the end of your reduction activities to balance off those emissions you can't yet decarbonize. Just to come back to what offsetting needs to be, it needs to be robust, it needs to be good quality. I'm sure you've heard about some of the bad press and the greenwashing that offsetting receives, and there are some really poor examples of it out there. So if you're going to use this as part of your strategy, you need to check that it is robust. And there's 4 key areas where that you need to check. Is it real? It seems a bit obvious. Is it verifiable and traceable? Can you actually be sure that that scheme is happening somewhere and it's real, and you can follow it? There's been examples where people have had a forest or a woodland and they've sold offsets, and then a year or so later they chop down the trees, they sell it for lumber, and it's gone. So it's real, but it's not verifiable because it's vanished. It's not there anymore. Importantly, it needs to be additional as well. It needs to be above and beyond what would have happened otherwise against that business as usual background. If the scheme was going to happen anyway, because it was getting government funding, it's happening. It's part of the bigger, wider reduction on carbon. What the offsets are doing is funding additional work that goes above and beyond and gives us extra carbon reductions or removals. It needs to be measurable. You need to be able to say how much carbon you've removed. That's clearly a key part of it as well. You can't just say, oh, we've got carbon offsets because someone's planted some trees. But how many trees and how much carbon are they absorbing and how long are they going to be doing it for? So it needs to be measurable. And there's some very robust schemes to do that and measure the carbon that's actually happening. And then it needs to be permanent. That's the tree example I just gave you a minute ago. Again, it's kind of, yes, you've got it there. Is it verifiable? Can you trace it to that woodland? Well, yeah, okay. But if they chop it down, it's not permanent. And particularly something like biomass, natural offsetting options, it needs to be permanent because you lose that carbon that you have otherwise stored. So my way of remembering that is ramp. You need to ramp up your ability to understand how robust the offsetting scheme is using those 4 keywords: real, additional, measurable, and permanent. So hopefully that's a good mnemonic for you. Certainly helps me remember what needs to go into a good offsetting scheme. And then lastly, it needs to be backed by the governance that goes with it: independent, transparent, and inclusive. It needs to have those kinds of good governance attributes to it as well. So some kinds of offsetting projects. This is loosely based on the carbon reduction hierarchy. You can put in renewable energy provision. You can fund solar panels or wind turbines, for example, that are giving you're either switching from one fuel to another, or you're avoiding the use of greenhouse gas emissions altogether. You can reduce your emissions. So there's some good examples here with efficient cooking appliances. This is probably one of the most common ones, where you take a dirty cooking system that uses wood and poor low quality fuels, and you move to a more efficient, cleaner cooking system. You reduce your carbon emissions, you avoid certain carbon emissions. You also have that reduced air quality impact as well, and the health benefits that go with it. Other examples include methane capture from landfill sites. Capture the methane, burn it through a turbine, through a generator, and make electricity, and you release the CO2. CO2 is a far lower impact kilo for kilo than methane does. So you're reducing that greenhouse gas impact directly. Other efficient appliances, the light bulb there is a good example. Switching your light bulb so you're being more efficient with the energy you use. And then there's removal, and this is where offsets and carbon removals overlap. So you can use natural systems to remove carbon directly from the atmosphere. Trees is the obvious one, but there are different ways of doing that. So reforestation, afforestation, and then ultimately carbon capture and storage. So the practicalities of this, the idea is that you compare a business as usual baseline, which is the blue line on the graph, against what would happen in addition if we were to do our scheme, and that's the kind of the orange line below. How much carbon are we going to reduce or avoid by doing a certain scheme? And we need to be clear about avoidance and removal. So removal with trees and other carbon capture systems is actually taking the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Avoidance is about saying, well, we were going to emit this much emission, we're now going to emit this much emission because we've got a more efficient energy system, we've got a more efficient cooking stove. So you're still emitting something, you're just emitting less than you would have done otherwise. So that's why it's reduction or avoidance. So the idea is that when you're setting up one of these schemes, or when the organizations are setting these up, they measure the reduction potential in the scheme, the gap basically between the blue and the orange lines. And they can add that up and say, well, if we do what we're going to do, we're going to remove so many tons of emissions per year. And then they can work out what the cost is. They can say, well, it's going to cost us X thousand dollars or pounds to do that. We know how many carbon emissions we're going to remove. So you can therefore put a price per ton on those emission reductions. And out of the back of it, if it goes through a robust scheme, you can get a credit basically. So 1 ton removed is a credit, a carbon credit or a carbon offset. That's essentially how that process works. And then some prices for typical offsets. Well, you can see some of the prices here. They can be far higher depending on the kind of scheme you're looking at. When we get onto carbon removals, those could be even higher still. But for your stuff like cooking stoves, supporting renewable power, more efficient appliances, you're looking at fairly meager amounts. These are US dollars, of course, so you need to divide it by, it's like 1.25 at the moment, or $1.3 to the pound. It's all done in dollars, I'm afraid, but you can see what some of those prices are that you can invest in. There are various different schemes that you can use to do that. So I'm just going to go through some of that at a high level. There's kind of two key routes to doing offsets. There's the UNFCCC Clean Development Mechanism. So this is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the people behind COP26. They've got the Clean Development Mechanism, and they have a process of doing offsets. It's truly global. It's backed by the UN and all the 170, 180 governments that back the Kyoto Protocol. It's all public. There's a separate validation between the project itself and the verification of the emissions. It is limited to developing nations. Not every country can have a CDM project within it, a UNFCCC backed CDM project. But essentially it's offsetting backed publicly in effect. And what you get out of the back of that are certified emission reductions. So 1 ton of carbon avoided or reduced or removed leads to 1 certified emission reduction certificate. There's also a voluntary carbon market. So these are private organizations, many of them are NGOs, and they work at different levels. Some are international, some are regional, some are just national companies, but they're not all the same. They're not all equal. They don't all have the same rigor as the UNFCCC's CDM. So check your ramp here. Real, additional, measurable, permanent. Check that they are all good. I've included 3 of the better ones that are often quoted on the right-hand side. The gold standard does what it says on the tin. You got the verified carbon standard, which is based in the US, and then got Plan Vivo as well, which is another one. These all have good, robust governance and transparency that goes with them. There are some slightly different rules. You can have offsets from developed nations as well as developing nations. There is an option to not disclose your emissions if you're a project owner. You don't have to do that publicly. And then there's some slight variations in how long those projects have to last for. What comes out of that one is called verified emission reductions or voluntary carbon units. They're the same as the CERs that you get from the CDM, the previous one I just showed you. They amount to the same thing. It's 1 ton avoided or offset, but they have slightly different names. So you can see there's quite a diverse market out there that you can go and look at. So we've talked about offsets, and some of those offsets are about avoiding emissions. So we're still emitting greenhouse gases, we're just emitting less than we would have done otherwise. There's a lot of ifs and buts that we would have done otherwise had we not invested in that scheme, and they could do something different to their business as usual. That's the additionality piece. There are some offsets that do have carbon removal. That's the planting trees essentially, because then that's actively removing CO2 through sequestration, through photosynthesis. But we need to go further than that. We need to actively be removing more greenhouse gas emissions as much as possible from the atmosphere. So like I've just been saying, it goes further than compensating, your emissions are here and you're balancing them off by reducing emissions somewhere else by the same amount. So that's kind of the offset process in simple hand sign language. But there's lots of different ways to sequester carbon, more than just planting trees. The report on this slide from the Royal Society is really accessible in terms of how you understand what the different schemes are, where they're at in terms of their development. Many of these processes are proven, but they're still at a nascent pilot stage. There's got to be a lot of investment to get them going and get them off the ground, essentially. Yeah, some are more developed than others. So I'm going to bring up 5 examples of what they are. So afforestation, reforestation, that's essentially growing land-based plant material. So reforestation is essentially saying you had a forest, it was denuded, we're going to plant the trees back. Afforestation is saying we didn't have a forest there before, but we're going to go and plant one anyway. Kinds of amounts to the same thing, planting trees, but making sure that they're permanent rather than coming back 10 years later and chopping them all down and turning them into pallet wood that then goes off and eventually gets either burnt or rots in a landfill. There's an equivalent one in marine environments where you can grow wetlands and peatlands and you can restore coastal habitats. Same idea, it's photosynthesis again, but this is far more impactful because those plants in those systems can absorb 10 times as much carbon, and they can do it 35 times, was it the other way around, 10 times as fast in terms of their carbon absorption, and they can remove 35 times as much carbon from the ecosystem. Essentially, it's locked away underwater. So same idea as trees on land, but can happen much more quickly and to a greater extent. These are sometimes called blue offsets, if you ever go Googling for that. You can take your wood and you can build with it. We've been doing that for centuries, for millennia. So that's another good process because it locks away the carbon. As long as those buildings are maintained and kept, and the wood, isn't lost when the building is demolished, if the building is demolished, that's another good way of removing our carbon. And then we get on to some more of the high-end technologies. So bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, also known as BECCS, which is where you absorb that carbon into the plant life, but then you deliberately harvest it and burn it and capture the carbon emissions that come out of the top of the stack. And then you lock that CO2 away, either in a geological reservoir or you react it with other minerals to lock it away, turn it back into limestone, essentially, is one of the ways of doing that. Drax are doing that, or doing a pilot on that at the moment, up in the Midlands, taking plant matter, burning it, doing CCS on it and locking away that carbon. The other alternative is just to directly absorb the CO2 straight from the air with a machine. It's kind of the same idea as the previous one, but instead of having a tree, you've got a big fan that sucks in the air, it strips out the CO2, it isolates it from the rest of the atmosphere, and then it locks it away again. It either compresses it, puts it in a geological reservoir, or they react it with minerals to lock it away in stone, effectively. So there's an example of that happening in Iceland at the moment, where they get the CO2 and they react it with granite or basalt, one of those kinds of rocks, and it locks the CO2 away. That's really quite a small scale pilot project, but hopefully we can develop that. I'm conscious of time, and I know a few of you have got questions, so I'm actually going to pause there. I have got a case study which I'll share with you on the slides that we circulate around. Some of you might have seen it if you came along to the school's 10th year anniversary last week. So I'm going to pause there actually, excuse me, and then I'm going to skip to some of the questions that I've got, because I think that's probably more value than me going through a case study. So I'm going to pick some of these out. So there's one from Steph here. Seeing companies offset their carbon by planting trees. This seems as greenwashing, as a tree is generally planted in a different country and can take years to grow. Yeah, it's kind of what I've been saying. Offsetting is part of the process, and it has a viable part to play, but we need to do lots of our own reduction activities first, follow that carbon hierarchy before we reach for carbon offsets, and make sure that they're robust carbon offsets. So if you do invest in a scheme overseas, there's nothing wrong with that. Like I was saying earlier, there could be social value benefits, there can be health benefits, biodiversity benefits as well. But do it as part of a carbon reduction strategy, not as the only thing. I've similarly had people call me up and said, can you help me offset my carbon? Basically help me work out how much I need to pay just to get rid of the issue. That's not really the right way of doing it. It's not illegal or wrong necessarily, but it's not the best way of doing it. Carbon neutrality standards. Most work to, so this is the second question, are there any other carbon neutrality standards other than PAS 2060? PAS 2060 is the main one that most people use. There are many organizations out there who use that standard and offer that service to that. So carbonneutral.com, there's many of them. There's many organizations out there with carbon in their name, unsurprisingly, or climate, that will offer that kind of service to help measure and then certify you as being in alignment with PAS 2060. Okay, so there's some other questions here. Yes, so someone here, so Amy Bennett has said gold standard and Vera are the first ones that came to mind. Yep, I'd agree with that. And natural-based solutions are preferable to technology. It can have a lot of benefits. Technology, my concern at the moment is that people are reaching for carbon capture and storage technologies to get us out of the problem. Whereas if we combine it with nature-based solutions, we have all those other co-benefits. Bringing back natural habitats and ecosystems is really important. We are in not only a climate crisis, but a biodiversity nature crisis as well. The two go hand in hand. So if we can look at nature-based solutions that reduce the carbon, actually actively sequester it out of the environment, and also at the same time provide biodiverse ecosystems and habitats, then it's a win-win, let alone all the social benefits of the jobs, the tourism that go in and around that as well. So, question from Simon, what is your view on the likely price rises in carbon offsets as availability reduces and the poor schemes are weeded out? I think as more people pile into the marketplace to buy them, like any supply and demand scenario, the prices will go up, especially some of those carbon removal technologies pick up as well. Some of those have got quite steep prices on them. So I'm sure they'll go up, but as more competition comes into the market, that should help balance some of that off as well. Question here from Anonymous. As a tier 1 contractor, if we measure our supply chain's scope 3 emissions, how is double counting if our competitors also use the same supply chain companies? Okay, so this is quite a detailed response that's probably, I'll try and do in summary, but it's probably better for one of our other workshops on scope busting between scopes 1, 2, and 3. The whole point of scopes 1, 2, and 3 is you can't double count. It avoids that. So only one organization can count a given amount of carbon emissions as their scope 1. Lots of other people can have it as their scope 3, but then because it's scope 3, you know it's not your direct responsibility. It's that other person's who has it as a scope 1. What you need to do between yourself and your contractors is to understand if you have, or if they have operational control over those emissions, that will be their scope 1 emissions, and therefore it's your scope 3. So there's a process to go through called consolidation approaches in terms of understanding who has that ownership or responsibility for those emissions. Essentially, if you own or control that process or that machine or that facility, you have responsibility for those direct emissions, therefore they're your scope 1. And for everyone else, it's their scope 3. But the standard does explicitly say that you can have more than one organization saying that those are my scope 3 emissions, and they're all pointing to the same emissions. But it's there deliberately to stop double counting. So another anonymous, there are construction companies out there claiming to be net zero carbon, and yet many of their offset schemes are carbon reducing rather than removing from the atmosphere. Is this acceptable? Can they legitimately claim net zero? At the moment, the way it is, most of the schemes out there are offsetting schemes rather than removal schemes. There's some which are offsetting, like the stoves, that kind of thing. Some are removal, such as planting trees. The ones which are truly going to absorb lots of carbon are in growth, in development. So at the moment, we're saying short term, yes, you can use those offsetting as part of a claim towards reducing your carbon. But long term, we need to move towards actual carbon removals rather than relying on avoidance and reduction schemes. That's okay for now, but as the market develops, we should be moving away from reduction and avoidance schemes and more into removal schemes. The bigger question behind that is what their scope is when they talk about net zero. Are they talking about just their organization, the scope 1 and 2, or are they looking at the whole value chain up and down? Because then they can say they're net zero, because if they're looking at all their suppliers, all their customers as well, that's really the clincher for net zero. So how are offsetting schemes regulated? Seems like a combination of potluck and Wild West. Yeah, which is why I was pointing people towards the gold standard, Plan Vivo and Vera, the US one as well. Go with schemes that are robust and trusted. It's like any marketplace. You can go and look at any product that you might buy, and there's going to be lots of suppliers out there, some that have got a greater brand reputation and a good reputation, and others which are a little bit shonky. It's the same idea. Go and choose those who are more respected and have that better reputation. What we need is that knowledge to understand how we choose which ones are the better ones. And then a final one from Yvonne, because we're at 2 o'clock. Any suggestions for UK-based blue carbon offset companies and schemes for our offsetting? I don't know of any in the UK yet. Most of the blue offsetting schemes I've seen have been around the Caribbean, in more tropical waters. A, because they don't have the seasonality that we have, and then the plants are continually growing, continually absorbing carbon, so you can get good returns. But also because there's lots of biodiversity that needs enhancing there as well. I mean, we need it here in the UK, but I haven't seen any UK blue offset schemes yet. That's not to say they won't come on stream soon. I'm going to pause there because we're at 2 o'clock. Thank you for your questions. Hopefully I got round to as many of them as possible. As I said earlier, the link to the feedback should be in the Q&A or in the chat box. Let me just check. It's in the chat box. So if you can see the chat box, there's a link to an Office Forms questionnaire. Very simple, but really useful for us. Please, if you can just spend a minute, go yes, no, 1 out of 5. Here's a little comment, really helpful for us. And as I also said, the recording and the slides will be made available in due course from my colleague Toby. So thank you for your time and attention. Hopefully that's been helpful. It was a rather whistle-stop tour through net zero carbon and offsetting. There are more courses in the school that give you a deeper insight into some of this as well. But for now, thank you for your time and have a good afternoon. Thank you.